evening, everyone. I'm Wendy Lavender from Prairie Lights. We are so excited to have Saket Soni here tonight, who will be in conversation with Cesar Rosado Marzan to talk about Soni's new book, The Great Escape, a true story of forced labor and immigrant dreams in America. And now I'd like to introduce Robin Clark Bennett, who is the director of the University of Iowa's Labor Center. And I have to turn the music off.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Saket Soni. He is a labor organizer, author, and a powerful leading voice on the ways in which climate, worker dignity, and racial justice intersect. Currently, Soni serves as founding director of Resilience Force, the voice of the rising workforce rebuilding America after climate disasters. Saket Soni was profiled as an architect of the next labor movement in USA Today, chosen as a 2022-23 Aspen Institute Fellow, and was named one of Fast Company's most creative people in business for 2022. His work was also the subject of a major New Yorker feature story in November 2021. We at the Labor Center are also proud to count Saket Soni as a friend. In 2013, he served as keynote speaker for a conference we hosted in Iowa City, which was attended by leaders of the then newly formed Center for Worker Justice of Eastern Iowa. And his visit helped spark momentum and ideas that fueled their victories in the years that followed. Since then, he and his organization's leaders have returned as speakers for several other conferences, always graciously sharing their experiences with Iowa workers. So this evening, we will discuss his masterful new book, The Great Escape, a true story of forced labor and immigrant dreams in America. The book, about America's first climate resilience workers, was featured on NPR's Fresh Air and called a must-read by the New York Times. Please join me in welcoming Saket Soni back to Iowa City.
So it's my great pleasure to be here today with everyone, and especially.
There's another one behind you.
Yeah, it's my great pleasure to be here with everyone. I had an opportunity to read this book during the summer and finished it recently. So Saket asked me to start by saying some things about the book. I'll be very brief about it, and then we'll have a conversation. And then the last 20 minutes of this event, we'll open it up for questions from the public. There were so many things. So many reactions I had to the book that the only thing I can really do is just say a few phrases and words and just leave it at that, right? So one of the things is, solidarity is very much a part of this book, but right along solidarity is betrayal. It's a tale where there is a lot of solidarity and there is some betrayal. There's a lot of love in this book, so much, and not only between these workers, so these 500 workers who came from India, and between them and the families they left behind, but also among themselves. It really is a love story in many ways. I appreciate it so much. Just the body language that is described by Soni is just so interesting, and so it really brings to life the whole book when he's telling you what is the body language of these various persons. And I don't know if that's your instincts as an organizer, your training in theater, but it's very much live right in this book. I was just going to say food, but it's not just food. It is meticulously prepared, good tasting, nutritious food. It is such an important part of this book because it's not just any old plate of food. I'm a lawyer. I teach at the law school, and I have to say lawyers is another important word I want to say here. Good lawyers, bad lawyers, lawyers. Lawyers are a part of this book. Also, because of my interest in law and law enforcement, I would say DOJ versus ICE. There's a story there about a conflict even within the U.S. government and how they were attempting to deal, right, with the situation of these workers. And yeah, and so those, I would say those were my main reactions, Saket, to your to the book. The book has received impressive acclaim by folks like Naomi Klein in the New York Times, Rebecca Solnit, NPR. So it really is a masterful book, and I advise everyone who's interested in all these various things to read it. But without much further ado, I would like to start to ask some questions, right? So let's start with the first one here. So The Great Escape tells the story of how you became a 28-year-old community organizer up against one of the largest forced labor rings in modern American history. But before that, you actually started out in theater. Oh, right? Tell us about that.
Sure. First of all, thank you for that really generous introduction, Cesar, and thank you, Robin, and thank you to all of you. What an amazing crowd. I am really, really thrilled to be in Iowa City. Yes, I was a theater major. My parents are probably the only parents in the 5,000-year history of India to allow their child to go to the United States to study theater. And so I came to Chicago and majored in theater and was running around directing plays and writing plays. That was really my introduction to the United States. Chicago is, of course, as you all know, an incredible theater town. So that was my first immersion into adult life in the United States. But then something happened. I missed an immigration deadline at a critical moment, and after that, 9/11 happened, and I was undocumented, and I lost my foothold in stable American life, and that's really when I became an organizer. First because of my own personal experience, and then because of things that people around me were going through. I eventually wound up staying in organizing, leaving theater and becoming a community organizer full-time in Chicago. But it wasn't until Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast and New Orleans flooded after the levees broke, and the Gulf Coast became, an image that we were all watching around the country. It wasn't until then that I went to the South, I went to New Orleans, and really learned what labor organizing was. That was the beginning of my journey in labor organizing, and also the beginning of the story I tell in this book.
So you begin with a dramatic description of the night of the call. When my parents called me the night of my 29th birthday, I was lying in wait for a human smuggler. What happened that night?
Well, so I was in New Orleans late one night on my birthday, and this was just months after Hurricane Katrina. So the Gulf Coast had become the world's largest construction site. The rebuilding of the Gulf Coast was being carried out by immigrant workers, largely migrant workers, many of whom were immigrants from other nations, many of whom were undocumented. These were the people who were doing the rebuilding. Every morning, at 5 a.m., I'd get out to a place in New Orleans called Lee's Circle. It was, the entire business district was organized around a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee. And this Robert E. Lee statue also turned into the hiring hub for migrant workers. Contractors would pull up before dawn with buses. Migrant workers would get on the buses and get taken out into far distant corners, still dark corners of the Gulf Coast to carry out the rebuilding. And I'd get on the buses and I'd go after them, and I'd try to protect workers as I could. And that's what I was doing. I was running a tiny little worker center, much smaller, by the way, than the very incredible and very impressive CWJ right here in Iowa City. I was running this fledgling nonprofit organization trying to protect workers as I could when I got this phone call. It was from a man who was too scared to give his name. But I could tell from the way he was speaking immediately that he was from India. And I wondered, what on earth is a newly arrived Indian worker doing in the ruins of the Mississippi Gulf Coast? I would get a lot of calls from workers. Most were from Latinos. That was who was doing the rebuilding. Many from white and black workers local to Alabama and Mississippi. But I wasn't hearing from Indian workers. And then there was this man who sounded like he could have been my uncle. And it turned out that he was one of 500 Indian workers who were brought from India to labor camps in Mississippi and Texas to help with the rebuilding of the Gulf Coast. A large oil rig builder had recruiters that went out to India and brought these workers to Mississippi and Texas, put them in labor camps behind barbed wire fences. They were living in trailers that were on company property. They were living 24 people to a trailer, constantly surveilled. And for all of this, they had paid money. The recruiters had promised them green cards and good jobs and a chance to become American citizens. For this, these Indian workers had paid $20,000 apiece. $20,000, which is a lifetime, even generations of savings in India. And when they got to the labor camps, it turned out all the promises were false. There were never any green cards. So I had stumbled upon an astonishing crime, which was a forced labor camp containing one of the largest cases of human trafficking in modern U.S. history.
Well, we learn about that nightmare through the eyes of several of the 500 workers who wind up there, including Abi Raju. What did he expect and what did he find?
So Ebi is one of the point of view characters, one of the protagonists of the book. He is, at the beginning of the book, he's a young man in India, 20-something. I was once 20-something. Some of you are not yet, perhaps, but many of you, just casting my eyes around the room, remember being 20-something. And so just remember what your priorities were then. Mine were not very lofty, And similarly, Ebi, at the beginning of the book, he's this motorcycle riding young 20-something welder in India. And he's just returned from Bahrain from 5 years of work in the Middle East. And his biggest priority is not getting married. His mother wants to rope him into an arranged marriage. He's not that interested. He wants his freedom. He wants to date. He wants to see the world. But above all, he hasn't been home for 5 years, and he realizes that his parents, he hasn't realized it, but his parents have slid down the rungs of the economy. They're not doing as well as they used to. He wants to afford them a retirement. So he's trying to figure out how to do that. Workers in the Middle East weren't being paid as much as they used to be. He wants to figure out his next angle, the next place he'll go. And that's when he reads this ad, an ad in the paper that says that there will be green cards and good jobs in America. He somehow manages to gather $20,000. His father sells the house. His relatives empty their pensions. He takes a very high interest loan. And he expects that 9 months after he reaches the United States, he will get a green card. And his new wife, he does manage, he does wind up getting pushed into a a marriage. This is also a beautiful story. He doesn't want to get married, and his mother is pushing him into it, and then he accidentally talks to the woman his mother has chosen as his bride. He has never really talked to her up front. You know, he can't do that. It's against custom. But he winds up on the phone with her, and as soon as he hears her voice, he falls in love with her. So now they're courting, and then they get married. And by the time Ebby pays the $20,000 and leaves for America, his wife, Vincy, is pregnant. He expects his wife and their newborn child will arrive 9 months later. Well, one day in the future, Ebby is high up on an oil rig, rebuilding an oil rig, when he gets a phone call. It's his wife, Vincy. She hasn't been able to come to the U.S. yet. She's about to give birth. She's going into labor. And then the phone goes dead. And his son is born that day. And that child who's born that day, Ebby doesn't get to see that child for another 3 years because the promises were false. So that's an example of one of the stories in the book. Ebby's a central character. And I organized the book around these young men who are real human beings long before they become immigrants. They have all these hopes and aspirations. They think they're going to come into an American dream, and they're dropped into the middle of a nightmare.
So you write that the man at the center of the forced labor scheme was, of all people, a liberal immigration lawyer in New Orleans. Malvern Burnett always thought of himself as the immigrant's best friend. The last person you'd expect to find in federal court denying his role in one of the largest human trafficking schemes in modern American history. How does the immigrant's best friend wind up at the center of a forced labor ring?
Yeah, so Malvern Burnett is one of the most complicated characters I've ever encountered in real life, and certainly one of the most complicated characters in the book. It's true, he was the immigrant's best friend. When he was a young child in Louisiana, his Catholic parents took in a pair of Cuban refugees. And these were teenage boys. And when I interviewed, I had a chance to talk to Malvern, and he described these dinner table conversations in English and Spanish, where people couldn't quite understand each other, but they were trying to cobble together a bilingual conversation. And he told me that after those refugees left, the young Cuban teenagers left, they stayed with him for a long time. I mean, Malvern literally looked up to them. They were very tall. They were teenagers. He was a young 8 or 9 year old. They taught him how to play baseball. There was a time he told me that he threw the ball and one of them hit it so hard, clear out of the park and into the blue sky where it disappeared. The baseball bat broke, you know. I mean, that stays in a kid's mind forever. It stayed in Malvern's mind forever. And he grew up and he carried them with him out of Louisiana. He went to the Peace Corps. Then he went to law school, and he never forgot the Cuban refugees. And then there was a change in the immigration laws of the United States. There was suddenly going to be a legalization of migrants. And Malvern started a law practice. He was still clerking for a judge, but he was so industrious and hardworking that he started a law practice, and he saw himself as an embodiment of the Statue of Liberty, someone who would allow strivers to reach American shores and start American lives. But then Hurricane Katrina hit, and it destroyed his house, it hurt his family, and Malvern used his extraordinary powers as an immigration attorney for a different end. I think he was in a financial crisis, and he brought this extraordinary scheme to an oil rig manufacturer and described how they could bring in Indian workers. So in the middle of this trafficking scheme that is being tried in federal court, the principal defendant is a liberal immigration attorney.
The freedom journey at the heart of the book almost doesn't get off the ground. You describe setting up first a clandestine meeting with what you think is going to be just 3 workers in the basement of what they call the secret Catholic Church in Pascagoula, Mississippi. You eventually realize that this is actually the Sacred Heart Catholic Church. You open the door and there aren't 3 workers. There's 100. And that meeting doesn't go so well, does it?
Yeah, the meeting was a disaster. So after the secret phone call that I got, the anonymous phone call, there were 2 other workers who called me. And I thought, well, here are 3 workers from India. They're probably, I don't know how they got here, but they're probably working in the basement of some restaurant, probably for a relative who owns the hotel, right? They agreed to meet with me clandestinely at a place they called the Secret Catholic Church. It took a drive through Mississippi to find it. It turned out that in their very particular English, the name of the place they were describing was actually the Sacred Heart Catholic Church. And on my way there, I called my mother, of all people. Now, I had been pretty estranged from my parents at this time. You know, I left India. I was working in the United States. I wasn't that connected to India anymore. My Hindi, as a result, was very rusty. I never called home. I never called my mother. You know, when my parents called me, even on my birthday, I'd send them to voicemail because I was working. This was not good. I wouldn't recommend this kind of behavior to anyone. But it's where I was. You know, I was 20-something at the time. But I broke down on the way to meeting these workers because I needed help. I needed to deliver my complicated organizing speech to motivate these workers in Hindi. I could offer you a cup of tea in Hindi, but I couldn't talk about your labor rights and your collective bargaining rights. So my mother had me rehearse a whole Hindi speech. I confidently reached for the doorknob of the church room, expecting to find 3 people, feeling really confident that I could, you know, with my theater training, deliver the speech in a way that it sounded extemporaneous. And I opened the door, and there were 100 workers in there. And I delivered my speech in Hindi, and the workers were completely silent. And there was a long pause, just like this. And I felt terrible and confused. And then a worker raised his hand from the back and said, "Excuse me, could you do that over again in English?" It turned out that while I spoke Hindi, these workers were from South India. Most of them spoke Tamil or Malayalam, and there were a few English speakers among them who translated my speech into English. And it turned out, you know, they didn't have any use for me. There was nothing useful I could offer them. And the meeting ended with them all leaving. I thought I'd never see them again. But then a man came forward from the deep inside that crowd, a man named Rajan, who came forward and called me later, gave me a secret call, and became my partner in planning and executing the Great Escape at the center of the book. Rajan becomes my friend, my brother. He's the kind of partner that a labor organizer dreams of. And he was the one who organized inside the labor camp to and partnered with me to get 500 men out of the labor camp and into hiding in New Orleans.
So one of the most memorable images in the book is what they do after they escape. Surprisingly, they march back to the company gates with allies and TV cameras and throw their hard hats against the company gates in defiance. Was that the plan? What was the plan after that?
Well, so we had a series of problems on the way to that day. The biggest one was how to get 500 workers out of labor camps in the Deep South. And I don't want to give anything away, but a quick teaser, it involved lots of flavored cigars, lots of mini bottles of Wild Turkey whiskey, and the pretext of a fictitious but beautiful, but fictitious Indian wedding. That was the pretext to get the men out from under the noses of the guards into a nearby hotel where we planned the next day. The next day, we marched back to the company gates, and in an extraordinary demonstration of dignity and defiance, the workers threw their shiny hard hats at the company gates, rejecting the company. But then we had a new problem, which is, where do you hide 500 brown men in Mississippi? Well, there was only one place I could think of that we could afford, which was a battered hotel in New Orleans that was still under disrepair since Hurricane Katrina. So we boarded buses, got to New Orleans. The men hid in New Orleans in that hotel, waiting for the Department of Justice to call. We'd filed a criminal complaint with the Department of Justice, and the plan was to trigger an investigation, a criminal investigation. When that happened, the DOJ would send law enforcement officials, we hoped FBI officials, to investigate. Well, a day went by, then 2, then 3, then 8 days went by, and there was no law enforcement official. There was radio silence from the DOJ and the FBI. So we decided we would do what many people have done in the past. We would come out as undocumented and march. So the men came out as undocumented, and we undertook a march from New Orleans to Washington to go to the doorstep of the Department of Justice.
You say that of the start of that march, once they set off, something changed. A realization ran through them. We're really doing this. They walked tall with purposeful strides, holding signs inspired by the 1968 Memphis sanitation workers' strike. Dignity. I am a man. How did that march go?
So the march, started in New Orleans, where we were welcomed with cheers. There was a beautiful march through New Orleans, and every now and then we'd encounter a trombone player who'd play us a few notes of some song, or passers-by who cheered us on. But when we left New Orleans and went into rural Louisiana and then Mississippi, when we were really on the road through the South, we had a lot less cheers and a lot more jeers. There were bottles being flung from the windows of trucks at the men. None of this seemed to douse the men's spirits, though. Each time somebody swore from a truck window or threw a bottle from a moving car, people seemed to be more and more confident. And I think part of it was because they thought, yeah, it's going to be a hard journey, but once we get to Washington, D.C., we're going to get everything we wanted. They thought that they couldn't go wrong, and it was right there in the name of the institution they were marching to. They called it the Department for Justice. So they were absolutely confident that they would get justice on the other side. This confidence really worried me. These were people who were in India and then came to the United States, but only knew America from inside a labor camp. As new immigrants, they had more confidence in American institutions than most people born in the United States. They thought, well, at home, I have to pay a bribe, right? Or I won't get through the police. But here in the United States, there are free and fair elections and institutions work. So that was their expectation. And this was very, very worrisome. So I was really trying to think of ways to complicate their understanding of the U.S., to make them understand that it would take a fight all the way, not just walking to Washington, but in Washington.
That's Alvin Latner. You introduce him saying Alvin Latner came from a long line of hunters. and you give us a pretty extraordinary family chronicle that goes back to 1719. You're right. Latner men scoped out the land, stalked deer, hunted Native Americans, chased runaway slaves, laid ambush for jayhawkers come to steal their cattle. The young Latner breaks up his first whiskey bootlegging operation when he's 11 years old. Then winds up in a job in U.S. Customs chasing cocaine runners on speedboats through the Gulf of Mexico. For a man who was so secretive during your campaign, how did you come to know so much about him?
So I should say for context that while we were marching, what we didn't know was that deep inside the US government, deep inside the federal government, there were secret agents at work trying to dismantle our campaign before it even got off the ground. These were corrupt officials who had their own interests in colluding with the company and their own reasons to interrupt the DOJ investigation. It turned out that's why the DOJ, after the initial contact, never came and investigated. And the key figure in this was a secretive ICE agent named Alvin Ladner. This was a man who lived in Mississippi, and again, just as a teaser, because I really want you to read the book, had his own corrupt relationship with the company. So we knew nothing about this as we were marching to Washington, but then one day, I think on the 7th or 8th day, along the way, we looked up and saw that we were being surveilled from high atop a civil rights museum. I chased down the surveillors and traced them to what looked like a construction contractor's truck. I flung it open and it turned out to be the Alabama head of ICE. It turned out that there was a national dragnet in place to surveil our march that followed us all the way to DC. And the person who had been appointed as the law enforcement official in the DOJ's investigation was actually an ICE agent, Alvin Ladner, the same Ladner who had a connection with the company. So, I learned a lot about this, a lot more about this in the writing of the book. And I found out a lot about the Ladner family and the Ladner ancestry because I scoured the public libraries of the South and found deep inside the caverns of the Bay St. Louis Library in Mississippi an extraordinary, almost 1,000-page book called The Ladner Odyssey. And it took the Ladner family line and told the story all the way back to 1791, when the first Ladner, a deportee himself, a smuggler who was deported, put on a ship and sent to America, started the Ladner line, Christian Ladner, in Mississippi. This was the ancestry of Alvin Ladner, and in the writing of the book, I decided to go find Alvin Ladner, and actually did, and wound up interviewing him for the book.
So your personal immigration story parallels that of the men in fascinating ways, including the experience of being undocumented and facing racist violence after 9/11. How did that journey of yours connect you to what the men were going through?
There were some similarities, and then there were also differences. I became undocumented in Chicago after having been a foreign student on a scholarship. At the time I became undocumented, I didn't think about it as anything more serious than having an unreturned library book. And I know I'm in a town where all of you have some of those stashed away. I thought it was just a matter of paying a fine and moving forward. Then 9/11 happened, and the consequences of being undocumented suddenly became much more severe. 9/11 really led to an entire draconian regime that immigrants are still living through. Still, I spoke English. I could pass as one of the workers in a fit of anger. My closest friend among the workers said to me at some point in the book, "You could pass. We never could," and that was true. I could pass as American. And yet, having been through the experience, because I was undocumented, it gave me a way to connect with these workers, a way to be deeply empathetic to them, a way to understand the emotions of what they're going through. A lot of times, organizers are too much in a hurry, to be able to pay attention to the deep emotional lives of the people they're organizing. But I was very attuned, even though I was in a hurry. I was very attuned to those emotional lives. I think, in large part, because I had spent time as an undocumented immigrant.
So you describe some remarkable friendships that form in the book, especially with Rajan. Is that how I pronounce
Rajan,
his name?
yes.
Rajan. As you mentioned, he was your right-hand man in the escape from the camps, but then your friendship takes a painful turn. Tell us about Rajan.
Rajan was an amazing a human being, one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met in my life. He was the man inside the labor camp who came up to me and offered to partner, and that partnership started with having me smuggle him Indian spices and ingredients into the labor camp. The company ran a cafeteria. The only thing the cafeteria served was rice. Often it was moldy. On cold days, it was frozen. And the men were starving. They were doing work that requires incredible bodily strength, welding and pipe fitting. But the company wouldn't feed them. And that, as well as the threat of deportation, had sunk the men into this deeply demoralized space. And Rajan had the genius to know that if we were going to organize the men, we had to do it through food. And so I would smuggle him all these ingredients and spices of his choice. He soon found out that I didn't know the names of half these ingredients. I had to go look them up. I couldn't cook. I couldn't boil an egg. And so then Rajan and I started meeting in this hotel room across the river. It had a little one-burner plug-in stovetop. And Rajan had me learn to make dal, simple lentils, a soupy yellow dal with cumin. And I learned to cook from Rajan. Our friendship, every friendship has its rituals, and ours was food. Cooking together became our ritual. When the men escaped, Rajan commandeered the incredibly large kitchen of this battered hotel and cooked for 500 people, sometimes with me as his astonished assistant. When we got to Washington, D.C. and went on marches and visited members of Congress, each time we hit an obstacle, we would solve it with food. At some point, he cooked me this incredible one-pot meal with 22 ingredients that's described in the book. I can send you recipes after you've read it. It was just incredible. But yes, then our friendship took a turn. Rajan, unfortunately, there was so much pressure from ICE agents, from the government, and Rajan broke. He ended up allying with the immigration agents who wanted to dismantle the campaign. Our friendship came under tremendous strain, and it remains one of the great sorrows of my life. But I think that's what happens when you're under this incredible pressure and strain in a campaign like this.
So we've talked about how these men were among the first resilience workers, this growing category of workers, often immigrants, who respond to and rebuild after climate disasters. These disasters are getting more frequent and severe all around the U.S. Here in Iowa, we've had $55 billion climate disasters since Hurricane Katrina. How does the story of the Great Escape connect with the work you do with resilience workers today?
So after Hurricane Katrina, because of climate change, disasters have become more frequent and more destructive. You've had them in Iowa. The workers who rebuilt the Gulf Coast after Katrina ended up going from city to city building homes for people who lost their homes in hurricanes. They then crisscrossed the country as the California wildfires started. Um, and we started noticing that this group was now working 10, 12 climate disasters a year. They had become full-time workers rebuilding and repairing after disasters. So we gave them a name. We call them the Resilience Workforce. And we formed an organization called Resilience Force that follows them. Workers follow storms, and we follow workers to protect them. Climate change is here. There's a certain amount of harm locked in. There are going to be disasters, and our greatest hope of repairing and restoration is these workers who have become the white blood cells of the climate crisis. So, my team and I organize these workers, and I didn't know then that these Indian workers were among the first resilience workers. Looking back now, they now were the first generation of many, many workers who have come after. But at the time in 2008 or 2009, I had no idea what was coming.
So you include the love stories of many characters like Ebi and Hemant,
Hemant, yeah.
Hemant, in a way that really brings them alive. Why did you choose to do that?
I was thinking in writing the book about the way that immigrant stories are told. And it's often we get stories in the United States, stories about immigrants through the news cycle. And in the news, immigrants are either people with a problem or they are the problem. Those are the two ways we see immigrants reported. What we don't see is what they really are, which is full human beings, complex, full human beings. Somebody's child, somebody's mom, somebody's son, somebody's husband or wife, somebody with aspirations, but also somebody with complex problems and qualities you don't want, characteristics that drive you crazy. All of that is true of a human being, and all of that is true of immigrants. And I wanted to tell immigrant stories as human stories. That's why there was a debate about the book early on about whether it should start in India. Immigrant stories are often told in the U.S. as if immigrants are born the day they arrive in the United States. But people lead entire lives, often all the way up to adulthood, in their home countries before they arrive. That's what forms them, right? And I, got to know these men in such a rich way, and I thought I'd be squandering all those riches if I didn't write it like that.
So where are the Indian workers today?
So Ebi Raju, the worker high up on the oil rig, when his wife went into labor, was on a wonderful day, 3 years later, reunited with his wife and his child. It was the greatest thing I had ever seen, to watch that reunion, to watch Ebi waiting, really nervous, waiting for his wife and child, and to watch Binsi, his wife, watch her head pop up above the escalator. And I got to watch as Ebi's 3-year-old son jumped into his father's arms. And behind them was a river of fluttering saris, lots of multicolored saris, and women coming through, lots and lots of men being reunited with their spouses and their children. The men are now U.S. citizens. Many of them are part of the labor movement. They're all working. They're leading American lives. And it's worth remembering that it took an extraordinary fight to get them to see that day.
Well, those are all my questions. So we have some time to make, so that questions can come from the public to Saket. You have the microphone.
I have a microphone.
Yeah. So who wants to go with the first question?
With climate disasters, there's also exposure to toxins. I think about New Orleans and how much toxic waste was spilled when Lake Pontchartrain went away, burn stuff, what about the health of these people if they go to 10 to 12 disasters a year? What are they exposed to? Is there any study going on with, I'm sure they're not the precautions taken and with them and their health and maybe exposures that there would be when people are watching more closely.
Yes, very prescient question. We were just, Robin and her tremendous crew and I were just, we were just talking about that today. You know, as with any new economy, you know, when it opens up, there aren't rules. It's, you know, an American marketplace, and workers deploy themselves, and companies profit from it. It's no different here. There is a growing multi-trillion-dollar resilience economy because each year billions and billions of property damage are happening as a result of disaster. FEMA and insurance companies are spending enormous amounts of money trying to repair. Companies are getting a large part of that money, but very little is actually spent on worker benefits and safety and security. And, you know, these are largely workers of color and immigrant workers, people who have historically been in the margins of, you know, the American protections, and so that compounds their vulnerability. So, you know, I know a lot of workers who have been rebuilding since Hurricane Katrina, and they're only now finding out the full impacts of, you know, of that work on their health. I often compare it to coal miners, you know, who only many, many decades into their work in the coal economy were they realizing the long-term health impacts. In a way, we're still finding that out.
Camp Lejeune, they're finding all sorts of stuff.
That's right.
A long time ago.
That's right.
Are you seeing anything yet?
Oh, we're seeing
Are you
lots of health
tracking it?
impacts. Yeah, we're seeing lots of terrible health impacts and detrimental consequences. You know, we're now starting to kind of, with others, study that in a more systematic way. In the next few years, stay tuned, and you'll see a lot more on that. A lot more data, a lot more stories. Yeah.
Question over here.
No doubt it's taken up in the book, but I was wondering, an operation that large, one would think there would be a substantial number of people who knew better, who were in the know about what was going on, and can you elaborate on that?
You mean
State officials.
people, officials, yeah. You know, I think that so one of the things that was so fascinating for me to uncover and understand in the writing of the book was that although there were lots of people who saw everything, they were able to tell themselves and others that their responsibility was just to do their job. And their job was not to go up against the company or to do anything that rocked the boat. You know, I interviewed a labor camp guard who winds up as a cameo in the book. He's an incredibly moving figure. You know, he's a young man himself in his late 20s. His dad worked at that shipyard, or a shipyard nearby, and he was in charge of guarding the labor camps, not on behalf of the workers, but, you know, surveilling the workers, right? He was at one point ordered to deport some of the workers. And years later, when I interviewed him, he said it still haunted him. For a long time, he hadn't been able to live with himself. But it was his job, and he felt compelled to do it. And I think it's a metaphor for a lot of what we see in American life. You know, that officials, whether in the private sector or the public sector, wind up being complicit in much larger systems. They don't feel free to come and blow the whistle. And it makes it even more courageous what these workers did. You know, the most vulnerable people in the system often wind up being the most courageous. They're the ones who come forward and blow the system. The people who saw the way the labor camp worked all had US citizenship. Most were born in the US. They wouldn't have been deported. And arguably, they could have gotten different jobs, but they stuck with it. The people who were the most vulnerable, the immigrant workers themselves, though, came forward um, and blew the whistle on the company. It's a lot of what we find in our organizing.
Another question?
So, given the way the events unfolded, I can't help but wonder if I were you, or how often do you think to yourself, if you hadn't received that phone call that night in New Orleans, where would you be at, like, today?
I'd probably still be boiling eggs for dinner, or living off of French fries. I wouldn't have learned to cook. You know, I think at a profound level, I was brought a lot closer to my own home and family through these 500 men. 500 Indian workers were the last people I expected to meet, the last people I expected to have at the center of my life in New Orleans, of all places in the United States. But once I got to know them, they built me a bridge back to my own family. And I had a journey back to, you know, my language, my culture in many ways, my family. So I think I would have been a lot poorer, you know, without those workers. You know, my parents and my sister and I are very close. They've never been anything but supportive of the choices I made. But I think I wouldn't have gotten into such a deep friendship with them without the intervention of these workers. There's one point in the book where I have to say the worst thing that an organizer can ever say to a worker, which is, "We've lost. Hope is dead." At some point in the book, I believe we've lost. The ICE agents have won, the government has won, the company has won, the workers have lost, and I tell the workers that. And the workers absorbed all of this when I told them, and they decided to go into hiding, remain in the United States and go into hiding, because they still had debts in India to pay off, so they were going to work here. But they told me to go to India for them and meet the children they wouldn't meet, the parents who were, you know, who were getting older. They believed they would never go back home again. And I went to India expecting to be, face anger, and instead I got love, you know, from their families. I had been with their husbands and their sons when they couldn't be, and that made me family. After that, I went home to Delhi to my parents, and I sat and confessed my failure to my parents, the failure of the campaign, my failure. And my parents told me that I didn't need to earn their love, that it was just there for me. And it was the first time I really understood that. You know, every young person goes through a profound shift. First, you think you're valuable because of what you contribute. You have to have some value in a marketplace. Then you realize you're just loved because of who you are. You don't need to prove it. You don't need to earn it. And I think that that shift would have come a lot later if it weren't for these workers. So I remain really grateful to them, and they're still, you know, my friends. I'm still in their life. They're still in mine, and so we're very thankful for that. Yeah. So I'm glad I got the call. What a great question, by the way. Thanks for asking that.
find it extraordinarily amazing to work with 500 workers coming from the same background. And we all know that how organizing workers is always very challenging. And I was wondering if you can see any social or cultural aspect that can be seen as part of this success in terms of organizing and achieving those big goals. Anything that you can describe as that has been like really significant in achieving the goal related to this group?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and tell me if you relate to this. But I always think that the best organizing happens among people who become family to each other. When the bonds are deep, when the friendships are real. And I hear a lot of times in the United States people teaching organizing in a very different way. You'll hear sometimes from trainers that this is public life, these are not your friends, this is not your family. Well, it's true that you have to be clear that this is a job and you have responsibilities. I might say something mean, or someone in a family says something dysfunctional or mean, and you forgive each other. You can't do that when you're organizing. You have to have good relationships with people. However, you have to become family to each other. That's the only way you can have security in the bonds. And you have to be open to having your heart broken if people decide to go a different way. I think that's part of it. I've seen the insides of some really inspiring unions. When I've seen an extraordinary janitors union drive, I see people who have become family to each other, right? Through the fire, through the hard times. And I just think it's irreplaceable. It's not just another day of work. It's love and worship and hard work and food. All the things you do together as a family, in your family, you have to do with the people you're organizing.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
I'm just thinking, first of all, I'm from Hollywood, so I'm thinking movies, and I'm thinking now.
Oh, Hollywood, LA.
Yes.
Ah.
And I'm thinking of the strike going on now, and the workers there, and has anyone approached you about making a movie? I mean, this is a fantastic and important story.
Oh, well, you're so kind. I will tell you who has approached me about making a movie. Every worker in this book. They are very clear who from Bollywood they want to have play them. They have several candidates for who should play their wives. Their wives are not thrilled about who they want. They want some say in the matter. These are robust dinner discussions that go on for hours. People have come forward, workers have come forward with ideas also about how each of them is actually the protagonist of the movie. There have been versions of the movie that I don't come into. So I would love to connect you as a Hollywood native to the workers in this book, and you can talk about movies. Yeah.
I'll talk to all my Hollywood friends. Would you write the script?
I'm a little busy running a non-profit organization following hurricanes. I will leave it to hopefully the far more empowered screenwriters
When they
with
stop
rights,
striking.
respect, and a great contract.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and then we will have time for you to go up and talk to Soni and Cesar and have book signed.
Kind of off of that discussion, so how or did women have a role in your organizing?
Yes,
And
women
still do?
absolutely. Women played a big role. I mean, the story is what it is. It is the story of 500 men who were brought from India to the United States. My principal relationship was with those men, and in fact, this is the continuation of a labor system which for a long time has pulled men out of their families and communities and brought them as indentured servants you know, to staff plantations, to come to the, you know, the Middle East or the West Indies, and elsewhere. So it is a continuation of that tradition. My first and principal relationships was with the men. And so the protagonists of the book are those men. Many of the men, though, were married in India before they arrived. And in India during the campaign, the wives played an enormous role in organizing in India. They would go on hunger strikes, they would do marches, they would go to their local elected officials and push for Indian officials to talk publicly about what was happening, you know, to their loved ones. In the book, there are key women characters. One of the men, Hemant Kutan, is a police officer's son who has a high school sweetheart who he wants to marry. The problem is that his high school sweetheart is several rungs above him in the caste system, and so he's trying to have a love marriage, and her dad is rejecting him. That's what gets him to want to come to America. There's another woman, Ebi Raju's wife, Binsi, who is just like an extraordinary fighter for her husband, and at the same time they go through a heartbreaking loss of faith in their marriage in the middle of it all, as any couple would, you know, going through this kind of tribulation. So they are characters, and it's been really interesting getting to know the complete families once they arrived, and seeing the role that women play now in those families, in the politics of the household, in getting out to vote, in joining unions. Many of the men were incredible freedom fighters, but once their wives arrived, those wives ended up becoming much more active in the day-to-day civic engagement and union engagement in their day-to-day lives. So they're very much characters in life, and some of them are characters in the book. Yeah.
So Prairie Lights wants to thank you both so much for coming. I can't wait to read this book.
Thank you. Can I just say a huge round of applause for Prairie Lights, and a huge round of applause for Cesar for being an amazing interviewer, and to you, Robin, and everyone here who invited me. Thank you so much.
Let me actually, and I'm going to even add to the words of gratitude, which is that this was possible because of sponsorship from the UI Global Health Network, support from UI International Programs, and I want to thank Dean Ganem, who is here. I think he's still here. And also support from the Center for Human Rights. I want to personally thank Claudia Corwin and Kimberly Richmond. I want to thank Molly Bartlett, the Managing Director of Resilience Force, and Cesar Rosado Marzan. That's the team that helped bring this together, and so thank you all. And so much thanks to Prairie Lights. Deep thanks to Prairie Lights. And above all, thanks to Saket Soni.